And for the next 2 years, Paul will rent a lecture hall called the School of Tyrannus. And from that hall, he will raise up a kingdom community in the city of Ephesus, and he will also train workers. And while he's in the city, 2 Ephesian men come to the Lord. Their names are Tychicus and Trophimus, and they are added to the 6, making up 8. They show signs of being called to the apostolic work. So now there are 8 men who are being trained by Paul of Tarsus, and Paul will eventually send those men all over Roman Asia, and they will plant churches in the cities of Philadelphia, Sardis, Smyrna, Thyatira, etc. And you can find the names of those churches in the first 2 chapters of the book of Revelation. In addition to that, people from all over the empire come to Ephesus on business all the time. And they hear that there is this subversive radical named Paul of Tarsus who is preaching 5 hours a day in the hall of Tyrannus. And so as a result of all of this, all of Asia hears the word of the Lord. And I just quoted the New Testament. Now, there is a man named Apollos who knows the baptism of John. And he begins preaching in the synagogue, and Priscilla and Aquila take him aside, and they begin to teach him about the gospel more accurately, filling in the gaps in his knowledge. And so when Paul is in Ephesus, Apollos visits him there, and so does Sosthenes, who is still part of the church in Corinth. Now Paul will spend a total of 3 years in Ephesus, and a number of big things happen there. And let me just reiterate something I said at the front. If any part of this story that I'm telling you is unfamiliar, which I think it may be, even if you've been a student of the scriptures for any length of time, I give you the sources, I connect the dots, I provide documentation, both biblical and historical, for every point in the book, The Untold Story of the New Testament Church, revised and expanded. You can't footnote a spoken message. It will be unlistenable. So again, I point you to the book if you have a question about any of this. So Paul will spend a total of 3 years in Ephesus, and here are some of the big things that happen. And by the way, we know he was there for 3 years because when he met with the elders in Ephesus in Acts chapter 20, and he bids them farewell, he tells them that he was with them for 3 years. Here are the big things that happen in Ephesus. First, Paul gets word about the church in Corinth. The believers are having a major crisis, and Paul will end up writing 4 letters to the Corinthian assembly. We have 2 of them, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but the other 2 are lost. And Paul actually mentions those lost letters in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and also in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. Now, I don't have time to tell you the full story, but here's a summary. The church in Corinth had more internal problems than any other assembly in the first century. While Paul was away from the church after he had planted it, Apollos, who was an educated Jewish Christian from Alexandria, Egypt, visited the church. He was a Hellenistic Jew with a Greek mind, and he wowed the Corinthian believers, particularly the Greeks in the church, with his logic, rhetorical skills, and his polished rhetoric, as well as his knowledge of the Hebrew Scriptures. Peter also visited the church in Corinth, and he wowed the Jewish believers in the church with his signs and wonders and displays of God's power, something he was known for. And when both men left, when Peter and Apollos left Corinth, the church began to fracture. Some were saying, "I'm of Peter," undoubtedly the Jewish believers in the church. Others were saying, "I'm of Apollos," undoubtedly the Greek believers in the church. Others were saying, "We are true to our founding apostle Paul, so we're of Paul." And still another group were complaining, "You all are wrong. We're of Christ. We're the correct ones." A businesswoman named Chloe has some people from the Corinthian church working for her, and they visit Ephesus, and they singe Paul's ears with some of the horrors that they observed were taking place in the assembly in Corinth. Around the same time, 3 brothers from the Corinthian church visit Paul in Ephesus. Their names are Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. And when they arrive in Ephesus to see Paul, they ask him a series of questions that the church in Corinth has been grappling with. Now, if you read 1 Corinthians chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, Paul deals with the divisions surrounding Peter and Apollos. And news of that rift had come to Paul from Chloe's people. Then in chapters 5 and 6, the apostle addresses other problems he's heard from Chloe's people, like incest and civil suits. Then from chapter 7 onward, the apostle answers a list of questions that the Corinthians sent to him by the hand of the 3 brothers who visited Paul in Ephesus: Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. Sosthenes is with Paul when he pens the letter. That's why his name appears in the greeting. Paul, called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and our brother Sosthenes, to the church of God in Corinth. In short, Paul's epistles are his way of dealing with crises in the churches when he cannot be present. Unfortunately, sometime after he writes what we call 1 Corinthians, the situation grows so bad that he has to pay the church a visit. But it doesn't go well at all. It is known as the painful visit. Furthermore, the agitators had visited Corinth. They're trashing Paul. They're throwing the church into more confusion and more division, and Paul responds to them and their gospel in 2 Corinthians. And he excoriates the leader of the agitators, the thorn in the flesh, in chapters 10 through 12. The second big thing that happens when Paul is in Ephesus is that 2 men came through Ephesus while Paul was ministering there. Both of them live in the city of Colossae, which is approximately 100 miles east of Ephesus. One of them is named Philemon. The other is named Epaphras. His fully extended name is Epaphroditus. He is known as Epaphras by the Asians, that is, in Ephesus, Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis, and he's known as Epaphroditus by the Latins, that is, in Rome and Philippi. And Paul shares the gospel with both men, and they are converted. And Epaphras spends time with Paul, so he lives in the church in Ephesus for a time, and Paul trains him with the other 8 apprentices. Epaphras is called by God to the apostolic ministry. Paul can detect this, and he brings him into the training. Epaphras goes back home to Colossae, and he raises up a church in his hometown, Colossae. He also raises up assemblies in nearby Laodicea and Hierapolis. So 3 new kingdom communities are planted in the Lycos Valley at the hands of Epaphras. The third thing that happens in Ephesus is that his ministry is extraordinary. He performs miraculous healings. He also confronts occult practices. Ephesus is a major center for the occult, and so many of the new Ephesian converts to Jesus Christ who previously practiced magic publicly burn their expensive occult books demonstrating radical transformation. But that eventually gets Paul in hot water. Paul's ministry in Ephesus is a mixture of glory and gore. While God uses him mightily, the hardships he faces there are unbearable. Speaking of himself and his co-workers, he will tell the Corinthians about his time in Ephesus, saying, "We do not want you to be uninformed about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death, but God has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope, that he will continue to deliver us as you help us by your prayers." I just quoted from 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Now, toward the end of his stay in Ephesus, Paul faces violent opposition from the local silversmiths. A massive riot erupts in the city theater, one that threatens Paul's life, though he is ultimately protected. And the apostle will later reflect that he worked among the Ephesian believers night and day with tears. You can find that statement in Acts chapter 20.